everyone. Today we're going to do a brief overview of SQL auditing with Netwrix Auditor. First, you might be wondering exactly what it is that SQL does. SQL, or Structured Query Language, is used to manage databases. Specifically, it is a language that is used to modify data in a set for organizational purposes. We use SQL for Netwrix in order to keep the data we collect from our data sources organized and readily available for reporting and searching through our console. What we are looking to monitor in SQL are configuration changes, SQL and Windows authentication, and changes made to data in database tables.
So starting off with some of the basics of SQL itself on the side of the actual instance and some of the other portions of it. The Management Studio is what's going to be kind of your tool to actually access this instance that you may be working on. It'll be under kind of essentially your Microsoft SQL Server Tools folder most likely when you're going into your Start panel, and then from there it's the actual SQL Server Management Studio, which is actually just what is up here in the background. And as soon as you have that opened up, it's then going to go into the portion of it here where it's going to show the connection to that. Going into there, at least if you have already had this set up and you have the account that you're currently logged in with as a user of the instance itself, then it will be able to actually connect to it just fine. And from here, once we are inside of the actual database, you're going to see the SQL instance name. And from that point, once you expand to the databases portion of this, we'll end up actually seeing the names of the various databases that have been created for the monitoring plans, which you can see that I've had a good couple of those so far that have been created for various monitoring plans of any sort. And going through these ones and whatnot, you're going to run into having to go into a certain database to see if the activity has been collected recently of some sort, as just kind of an example of that. And to do so, for actually being able to see where the data has been collected within the database, it's going to be within the actual tables portion of that database being mentioned. So when expanding this, you're then going to see a lot of other DBO whatever it may be there overall, but primarily the main ones to factor in for what you may end up dealing with overall are going to end up being the DBO changes, as well as then for things related for state and time is actually going to come down to the dbo.conf items, as well as then the dbo.conf sessions. Primarily the sessions is going to be what they call the zero session that is stored here in the side of SQL, which then entails the actual state and time snapshot that's involved for the monitoring plan at the time. With this one being a logon activity, there's not going to be anything there, but if we were to at least take a look into the dbo.changes table, this is going to have the recent collected changes for that monitoring plans database. And from that point, what you can actually do to be able to see within it, or to run a query, so to say, is to actually right-click on it and hit the Select Top 1000 Rows. When doing so, that's actually going to start a query to pull up at least some of that more recently collected information. And from here, there's ways of being able to kind of then confirm even on how far back the data is being held, as well as then the most recent, and actually currently as it's set, it's going all the way back until it looks like the 10th of October is what it's going back here. So if we were to actually go down one more, it's just like an easy query to kind of remember. There's the order by, which is going to essentially flip the when time frame of this around. By actually then just going below the line that you see of all the current text after having hit the Select Top 1000 Rows, and then entering in order space by, and then within brackets you're going to do the when, and from here a DESC for descending should then turn it the other way. Yes, and as you can see here, we then go up into the current date of it being April 7th of 2020. So with that, at least you should be able to correctly see the time frame that's set for the retention period overall within Netwrix Auditor as kind of that date that should be back, which by default it's 180 days. And October to April at least is roughly 6 months as well on that also, so that would make sense for it exactly at that 180-day time frame. But then going on from here, you have the actual, like the conf sessions table that I was mentioning before, which, let me pull up one of these that I should have that available to actually show an entry with. But that's going to involve your actual state and time data. So again, doing the same thing where selecting the actual table, right-clicking on it, hitting select top 1000 rows, you then are able to see what entries it has available. And with this one, this is my current state and time snapshot that is loaded in on the side for reporting of the Active Directory monitoring plan that I have set up. And with doing so, with state and time as well, it's going to also come down to that conf items that I was mentioning as well that has a bit of an involvement in the actual state and time data collection itself, which again, right-clicking onto the table, hitting that select top 1000 rows, gets you then over into the new query. From here, you can still do kind of some of those order bys or so on or whatnot from that, but primarily when you're in these databases, you may end up doing a delete from and essentially copying over this same portion of what you see above. You can put into the next line down, and what that's going to allow you to do is if, say, for some reason you had an issue with state and time occurring or you had to clear that out, that's one way of doing so on the conf items and the conf sessions tables. From here, going into one of the other parts that's going to have a large play in the SQL side of things altogether is also the security tab with the logins. For the side of SQL auditing, the account that's doing the data collection does need to be a system admin of this actual instance itself. So in doing so for that, making sure that the user has a login by, if they aren't already in the list, then right-clicking the login folder and hitting new login. And from here, adding in the actual user by the domain / username format, and in the server roles portion, making sure to select the system admin will be the key item there.
There are a few things we need to consider before we begin auditing. First, we want to ensure that we have the required ports open as shown in our Help Center article here. In this case, we need to have TCP port 1433, UDP port 1434, and dynamic TCP ports 1024 through 65535 open for outbound connections on the Netwrix host and open for inbound connections on the SQL server. On the SQL server itself, we don't need to perform any special configuration. However, if the user would like to make use of the before and after filter values in our search tool, they will need a primary key for their tables. This Microsoft documentation provides a lot of useful information on how to get started with this process. Lastly, our data collection account will need to be a domain user so we can authenticate to SQL via Windows. When creating the logon for our collection account within SQL Management Studio, we will want to ensure that the System Administrator role is applied. To add an item for monitoring, we will click Add Item, and then specify the instance name as shown in the properties of the instance in SQL Management Studio. In my case, I would type in bn-netwrix /SQL Express, and then click Add. Within our SQL monitoring plan, we have a few configuration options that can be found within the Edit Data Source menu. From here, we can choose the types of logons that we want to monitor. And in the Data tab, we can specify the databases, tables, and columns we want to include or omit from change monitoring. Note that this feature is turned off by default, so you may want to point it out to customers when setting up a new plan.
Netwrix takes snapshots of the server and compares them to look for changes. When we find a change, we then look for correlating traces to determine who made the change and when. For example, if a change is done to a database name that was collected upon previously, Netwrix will then see this name change by comparing the snapshots and then searching for the correlating trace to find who made the change and at what time. The key part of this to note is that this collector runs incrementally every 15 minutes to see these changes. So if the change to the database name was completed directly after a completion, but then reverted before the next completion to what it was actually previously, the change will not actually be seen in reporting, as the snapshot does not see that there is any difference between these. This is a common mistake that can occur when attempting to test the software, so be sure to remind who you may work with on this to manually update the plan when making these changes so that it is reported properly within the actual searches. Alright, let's go ahead and make a new table here into our testing database. So we're going to right click on over and get to that new table. And as a part of the process here, it's going to require you to create a column, so we're just going to name that 1, 2, 3, 4. But up in the top left here, we're going to hit the Save button. And this one's going to be called Table 2. So we'll go ahead and save this. And then after, just to make sure, we're going to go ahead and refresh the database itself here real quick by right-clicking, going down to Refresh here, and getting that to go. And then expanding on this once more, if we go on back down to it and on into the tables, we then see our Table 2. Now that we've made our change in SQL, let's go ahead and do a search on it and see what it looks like here in Netwrix. So what we can do is actually, by going into the monitoring plan and equals, have it set as SQL Server Monitoring. And then since this change was done on our database of testing, what we can do is a what contains and the name testing in it. As the what field is going to be anything that involves the actual change of the database or the, in this occasion, the table that we created, such as what you can see here.
To finish our training, I want to leave you with some useful tips and resources when it comes to working with SQL auditing. Our Netwrix auditing logs for SQL can be found here by default. And the SQL logs can be found here by default or within SQL Management Studio. The Netwrix knowledge base is a great resource that covers many of the issues commonly seen across all of Netwrix, including SQL auditing. You can test our connection with the monitored SQL server by creating a UDL file, entering the server name, entering the data collection account, and clicking Test. This will often give us a more detailed error that can help pinpoint where the issue is originating from as well. Lastly, a common tool you will use with any of our collectors would be the omit lists. Our Help Center article does a great job at describing what each omit list does and how to use them properly, as seen here. That wraps up everything you need to know to get started with SQL auditing.